Welcome to the Insight Meditation community of Charlottesville, Virginia. You can find all of our program offerings and information about our Sangha at www.imeditation.org. We meet weekly on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, currently on the Zoom platform for meditation and a Dharma talk given by one of our teachers. We also meet daily at noon Eastern Time on Zoom for sitting practice. We hope you can join us.
So I decided a couple weeks ago that I wanted to offer a talk about essentially what happens at the end of our out breath there, that little space, these transitional spaces between what has gone before and what hasn't yet arisen. As I was thinking, we are in such transitional spaces in our world. No matter how you slice it, whether it's the virus or politics or climate or whatever, that we're in this space of uncertainty and confusion and not knowing and kind of emptiness, everything that's familiar has evaporated, and then we don't know what's next. And my understanding of the teachings about dying is that it's exactly what happens as we die. That, there's this form, and everything that is familiar, our relationships, our world, just disintegrates. And then there's a space like that before something new arises. And the teaching, as I understand it, is that being skillful in that space is really crucial. And it seems so relevant to what we're dealing with now, being skillful in the space of confusion and not knowing is really skillful. You might even watch your mind. Right there. We can see how the mind sort of wants to goes, I don't know what's happening. Did she lose her connection? Is what's going on? And and so we can see how the mind just sort of jumps in right there. And how hard it can be to just be there in that moment of uncertainty, of not knowing. And for that matter, even with the mind, whatever it does there, without necessarily taking the mind's opinions about things to be any more than, my cat just meowed, just noise. So this is a perfect time. It's such a perfect time for us to practice. It can seem like it's so difficult. Everything's so hard. But it's a perfect time to practice. We talk about not going to the gym or something like that. It's like, well, we have all kinds of things to exercise our muscles about in terms of being with these transitional states. I was talking to Bill Detmer a little bit earlier in the week, and we were just talking a little bit about life and the election and transit in what I was going to talk about. And he referred to them as rabbit holes, So I thought, oh, that's good. I'll put that in my talk too. But it's the place where where the mind just kind of says, there's this, we pause there and we jump into the rabbit hole, we could notice that the mind will kind of make us anxious, huh? Or get us into gear, get us into some kind of movement that may or may not have anything to do with what's going on and may or may not be skillful. When I was a little girl, I used to go to sleepaway Girl Scout camp. Maybe you did too. And, we'd spend the day and we'd hike and we'd swim and do all these groovy things and great things. And then at night, of course, we'd go back to our little bunks and we'd snuggle in and we'd get all ready for sleep. And there was this moment between the end of the day and the beginning of sleep. Now, when I went to Girl Scout camp, my older cousin, who was a year older than I was, and who was therefore one of the big kids, and her friends would also, they would be kind of in the next bunk room over. And what they would do in that transition space is they would start very loudly, I might add, to tell ghost stories. So it's dark and I'm tired and I'm lonesome and kind of homesick. And they would start telling ghost stories over and over again about how, scary people and scary situations and uncertainty. And so there we would be, trying to go to sleep. But in that transitional moment, there were all kinds of ghost stories that were creating. If I listened to them, which was hard not to, A, because it was quiet otherwise, and B, because it was my cousin and she was one of the big kids, that if I listened to them, I would become profoundly anxious. And they were just ghost stories. And I was thinking, it's like there are gazillions of ghost stories right now. There are gazillions of people who are telling ghost stories about all sorts of things. It was like I stopped months ago listening to the pundits about the election because they were just telling ghost stories. It was like nobody knew, obviously. Nobody knew what was going on. So these ghost stories are like, the rabbit holes. If we listen to them and we fill this space of uncertainty with ghost stories, our own or others, that's where we get into trouble. So I wanted to talk about these transition states and how we work with them with our mind that can be either skillful or not so much. So the challenge of our practice is about training our minds. So I want to talk first about minds and how it can cultivate suffering. Secondly, I want to talk about how to cultivate freedom with all of that. I want to make it practical. Thirdly, how to do that practically. And then to have some kind of sense of our own dedication and leave us with a bit of inspiration. So the challenge of our practice is training our minds, no matter what. Training our minds to rest in these spaces of uncertainty, which are happening absolutely all the time. I've been practicing with just when I walk, there's a pause, there's a moment where nothing's happening. When I drink a cup of water, when I breathe out, there are these places of uncertainty, of not knowing, don't know really what's going to happen next. So the challenge of our practice is taking every one of those moments and letting it be, no matter what is happening, letting it be a cause for awakening. Remembering that suffering is arising. When it arises in here and not out there. And it isn't that mental arisings are particularly bad. My mind just goes into ghost stories sometimes. The problem is when I live in them, or as Bill would say, when I jump down the rabbit hole. It's okay to see rabbit holes, But living in the rabbit hole is when it becomes a problem. When I live in those stories, when I live in that chaotic quality of mind, that it's so difficult. And our tendency, the Buddha says, is uninstructed worldlings. Love that. I'm an uninstructed worldling. He says our tendency is to live in samsara, which is the tendency to keep mentally creating worlds and then moving into them. And we can certainly watch that going on in the news these days. The tendency to keep mentally creating worlds. Watch the headlines tomorrow morning, where they're creating worlds and then inviting us to move into them. So samsara is my human grasping onto experience, fixating on it, the difficulty of being with not knowing. The fact of the matter is, we don't know what's going to happen next. So being with my not knowing, but grasping on something, even a ghost story, fixating on it, and in this way wandering over and over and over again into suffering. And if I take it all too personally, if I identify too closely, if I hang on too much to those ghost stories, to those stories, my own or others, if I make them more real and true and permanent and solid than they actually are, I will suffer because I won't be able to just be with what is in fact happening or see what is skillful. I want to take what actually, I almost threw this out, but I'm very attached to it, so I'm going to leave it in. One of my favorite, I wanted to put a little politics in here. One of my favorite commentators, maybe yours too, is Republican David Brooks. I've just loved him for many years. And he talks about getting stuck, the suffering of getting stuck in the mental rabbit hole, politically, of purely partisan thinking. And I want to read to you a little bit. I've given you the link to his whole essay. And the title of the essay is, he says, I think it was a couple days ago, he said, what the voters are trying to tell us. Trumpism and what he calls wokeism are not equivalent phenomena, but they both serve as secular religions for their disciples. They offer a binary logic of good and evil, a cult-like membership experience, apocalyptic or utopian visions, witch trials for the excommunication of the impure, and the sense of personal meaning that comes with fighting a holy war. Both of these, he says, both sides have done it by telling a certain sort of story, what I call ghost stories. American politics, progressives commonly say, is all about the historical shift from homogeneity to diversity. They see America as divided between those enlightened cosmopolitans, Democrats, who welcome the coming diverse post-industrial world, and those knuckle-dragging racist troglodytes, Republicans, who don't. The first problem with this narrative is that it is perpetually surprised by events. Election after election, the emerging Democratic majority fails to emerge. The second problem is that it oversimplifies the different processes going on in America. Somehow, we have to have the racial reckoning, which is essential, while we understand the other mega narratives people feel are driving their lives. Third, it's just astonishingly smug, self-congratulatory, and off-putting. The voters reminded us yet again that the other side is not going away. We have to dispense with the fantasy that after the next miracle election, our side will suddenly get everything it wants. We have to live with one another. The key is loosening the grip the culture war has had on our politics and governance. Let's fight our moral differences with books, sermons, movies, and marches. not with political coercion. So in a very political way, in a very he's inviting us to let go of the rabbit holes of rumination that lead to anxiety or self-righteousness or demonizing or coercion or predictions or insistence of any sort. We work with our minds to see what is wholesome, or in another metaphor, to see what kind of seeds we need to plant. So the importance of thought. In the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, Sogyo Rinpoche says that somebody who had a near-death experience said, "It was a total reliving of every thought I had had, every word I had ever spoken, and every deed I had ever done, plus the effect of each thought, word, and deed on everyone and anyone who had ever come within my environment or sphere of influence, whether I knew them or not, plus the effect of each thought, word, and deed on weather, plants, animals, soil, trees, water, and air." The Buddha teaches us that what we do with our thoughts matters. What we do with our ghost stories matters. What we do about rabbit holes matters. We can practice. We can discover that whatever arises in these transition states is just the display of our minds. These are just my cousin's ghost stories. That recognition can set us all free, and we can choose how to respond. So in my own daily practice, these teachings continue to invite me to curiosity, to really look to see what I do with the daily news, how I relate to it, how I open to it, how I pay attention, how I respond, how I investigate in the body, how I investigate the summaries that the brain offers. The Buddha teaches that I might become disenchanted, if you will, with some of the ghost stories. There's a Suda that I wanted to tell you about. It's the Megi Suda, Meghiya, and I also gave you a link to this one. And it's a great story. It's Megi was apparently one of the Buddha's attendants, and very devoted, very advanced. And so one day, Megi sees this mango grove. It's really pretty mango grove. And so he goes to the Buddha and he asks permission. He says, if I go meditate in that mango grove, man, this is just going to supercharge my practice. It's going to be awesome because I already am like really, really pretty advanced. I go sit in the mango grove and, this is really going to be awesome. So he asked the Buddha for permission, and the Buddha, after a little bit, gave him permission to go. And as Megi said, to exert himself in meditation. It's like, yes, all right, I'm going to go on retreat and I'm going to, it's going to be really great. So here's what the Sutta says. He says, so on arrival, having gone deep into the grove, he sat down at the root of a certain tree for the day's abiding. So immediately, he was for the most part assailed by three kinds of unskillful thoughts. Thoughts of greed, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of doing harm. And the thought occurred to him. He went, how amazing, how astounding. Even though it was through faith that I went forth from home to the homeless life, still I am overpowered by these three kinds of unskillful thoughts. Thoughts of greed, thoughts of ill will, thoughts of doing harm. So he is like, oh my goodness, the mango grove is really lovely, but my brain, not so much. These thoughts are making me crazy. They're, causing all kinds of suffering. And we know what that's like, don't we? Yeah. So he goes back to the Buddha and he says, okay, this isn't working so well. Give me some advice. And the Buddha says, he says, Megi, in one whose awareness release is still immature, 5 qualities bring it to maturity. He says 5 things will help you here. So now I'm in the, okay, what do we do about it part of the talk. He says 5 things will help you. 1, he says, pay attention. Let me read it to you. There is the case where a monk has admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues. He says, in one whose awareness release is still immature, this is the first quality that brings it to maturity. Have wholesome friends. It's not about a mango grove. Have wholesome friends, he says. He says, furthermore, the second quality, the monk is virtuous. He trains himself, having undertaken the training rules, seeing danger in the slightest faults. He says, this is the second quality. Train yourself in virtue. In another sutta, to Mahanama, he tells him, contemplate your virtues. So 1, he says, have admirable people as friends and companions on the path. 2, he says, train yourself in virtue, contemplate your virtues. And then the third, he says, he gets to hear at will, easily and without difficulty, talk that is truly sobering and conducive to the opening of awareness. Talk on modesty, contentment, seclusion, non-entanglement, arousing persistence, virtue, concentration, discernment, release, and the knowledge of vision and release. He says that's the third quality. He says, listen and hear all of those. I'm reminded of, Jeff's offering us on Thanksgiving Day to come together and not only speak our gratitude, but hear gratitude. So that's the third quality that can actually strengthen our minds, to hear talk that is wholesome in all those ways. The fourth quality, he says, furthermore, he keeps his persistence aroused for abandoning unskillful mental qualities and for taking on skillful qualities. He is steadfast, solid in his effort, not shirking his duties with regard to skillful qualities. So the fourth one is he's persistent. He keeps doing it. He keeps being around, cultivating admirable friends. He keeps contemplating virtue and cultivating virtue. He keeps contemplating through talking about wholesomeness, and he's diligent and persistent. And then the fifth one is he's discerning, endowed with the discernment related to arising and passing away, which is discernment of seeing that things change and that we don't really know what's going to happen, but everything changes. So the Buddha teaches Megi. He says, in one who isn't yet enlightened, these are the qualities to cultivate. And then the Buddha goes on. He says, little thoughts, subtle thoughts, when followed, stir up the heart. Not comprehending the thoughts of the heart, one runs here and there, the mind out of control. We know this place. But comprehending the thoughts of the heart, one who is ardent, mindful, restrains them. When followed, they stir up the heart. When awakened, lets them go without trace. So if they stir up the heart, one lets them go. So we work with those 5 qualities: admirable friends, personal virtue, talk that is sobering and conducive to the opening of awareness, keeping your persistence aroused for abandoning unskillful qualities, taking on skillful ones, with all of these leading to discernment. Ah, this is the end of stress. This is, this is the cause of stress. This is the beginning of stress. So here we all are in this transition state, then, and wondering about how do we navigate these places, the suffering. And so Bill and I were talking, Bill Detmer, where are you, Bill? Let me find you on my screen. Oh, there you are. Hi. Bill and I were talking about this a little bit, and Bill told me a story about what he was doing, and I just thought it was a wonderful story. So I asked him if he would tell people his story. He would come tonight and just tell his story. You still on? You still up for that, Bill? Oh, you got to unmute yourself. What you did with your group on election day. You still up for that?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Okay.
Hi, everyone. It was fun to talk with Sharon about the transition, really, from the moment of dread of what was happening before the election to the time of rapid change, and how one was trying to navigate that in a skillful way. I was inspired by folks in my company who we decided to give everybody the day, election day, off, and we called it Community Day. And the idea was whatever's in your heart, participate in the democratic process if you want, by voting and being a poll worker if you can, or working for a political party, or something of some interest group, or call some people you haven't talked to for a while who might not have somebody to talk to, or etc. And the key is it's not about anything in particular. It's just about take the time to decide what's right for you. And what was so inspiring about it was, first of all, was how energizing it was for people, and to hear their stories the next day. And one of the stories was of a young man in his early 30s who had been very active in his 20s before he got married and had kids, politically, and being out in the community, doing a variety of social action type of things. And when he got married and started to have kids, had less and less time for that. And he said, so I started my day by writing letters to my congressmen and senators about some issues that I had been thinking about, writing him for some time. I used to do this all the time, but I just haven't had the time. And he said, the thing that was so interesting to me was how easy it was, what the reminder was of such small acts of participation, how much it made him feel sort of reconnected with the larger world. And that realizing that the small acts of doing that weren't all that, they didn't have to be huge acts. They didn't have to. It didn't have to do something to solve all the world's problem. That what it really meant was taking one step at a time, doing one thing at a time, picking something that was meaningful and doing it, in this case, once. And then he said, I was inspired. I put on my calendar once a month that I was going to do this for the rest of this year. And it wasn't like I was doing it because I was being told to do it. It's because I was inspired to do it and realized it wasn't that hard to do it if I created discipline and persistence. So to your teaching tonight, you know, whatever it is um, that we choose to use as a way to um, participate in the community or to help others, um, and instead of thinking of it as this insurmountable, difficult challenge that only a saint could handle, to be thinking of it as, these very small micro acts of kindness and opportunities for sharing and connecting with others, and that by itself, in this case and in other cases that I heard about in this day, help people, inspire them to be persistent, and also to see that, every little action helps. Thanks for asking.
Thank you, Bill. Awesome. So Bill is describing, what here we are in this. I mean, there's a transition at the end of our breath. There's this whole big transition that's going on. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen politically. We don't know what the next step is going to be. But the Buddha is inviting us to not go into ghost stories and to do something with our minds that is useful. So I'm going to invite you for just a ridiculously too short time, to just, if you want to go into a group of 3 and taking those 5, those 5 things that the Buddha says, just imagine one thing that you might do with your mind, and or maybe with your activity during this transitional time that could conceivably be useful to you personally, and maybe to the world, just because of how your mind is, or maybe in fact, in some kind of manifestation to the world. So the invitation, I think, is for us to be brave. To kind of notice the pull into those rabbit holes, and we get pulled in. It's not like rabbit holes are horrible things. It's just not so skillful, and to be brave and to be willing to pull ourselves out. Molly Ivan says, when you're in a hole, stop digging. And so we stop digging and we kind of remember what's useful to do with my mind, remembering that my mind matters. May this time of transition for us, such a good time to practice. Nothing is too difficult. I read a book by Anthony Ray Hinton. The title of the book is The Sun Does Shine. And the subtitle is How I Found Life and Freedom on Death Row. 28 years, he was convicted, wrongly convicted, spent 28 years on death row. How I found life and freedom. Wrongly convicted, 28 years on death row. We can do this. We can do this. And I want to end with a poem. And this is from Pablo Neruda. Um, and the title is Keeping Quiet. You've heard it before. Now we will all count to 12 and we will all keep still. For once on the face of the earth, let's not speak in any language. Let's stop for 1 second and not move our arms so much. It would be an exotic moment without rush, without engines. We would all be together in a sudden strangeness. Fishermen in the cold sea would not harm whales. And the man gathering salt would look at his hurt hands. Those who prepare green wars, wars with gas, wars with fire, victory with no survivors, would put on clean clothes and walk about with their brothers in the shade, doing nothing. What I want should not be confused with total inactivity. Life is what it is about. I want no truck with death. If we were not so single-minded about keeping our lives moving and for once could do nothing, perhaps a huge silence might interrupt this sadness of never understanding ourselves and of threatening ourselves with death. Perhaps the earth can teach us. Perhaps the earth can teach us is when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive. Now I'll count up to 12, he says, and you keep quiet, and I will go. So we will end there with many blessings for us all in these transition times. May our presence matter. Blessings to you each.